So we're here to discuss Ghosts of Transparency, Shadows Cast and Shadows Cast Out, a book that we published, Selena and myself, along with Vera Bühlmann in 2019. It came out with Burkhäuser. The book has 26 contributions, and we asked a series of authors and scholars to reflect on words that we had a curiosity with, like code, protocol, channel, data, spectrum, manifold, words that kind of circulate and that we were interested in kind of setting up kind of, if you want, a meeting with these words. And so we asked the authors to make very short contributions. And what we want to do today in a sort of a rather brief time is just to kind of discuss our own motivation for writing the book, the ideas that we worked with, Selena and I, and where we've gone with the ideas from the book or our own chapters since then. So I'll start by asking you, Selena, what was your motivation and interest in writing the book?
Thank you for this question. As we have already discussed a lot on the book, it's nice to come back to after this finished process and to look at what actually was the motivation. I would start from these terms myself. I was very interested in the way these computational terms and computational processes in general take part in architecture and how they inform each other and how this is being talked about, especially because I found it somehow problematic or lacking that the way this relationship was discussed was mostly in terms of causality. It was really often explored how computers have impacted architecture, or even maybe how architecture has informed the way we talk about computers in terms of computer architecture. But somehow, beyond causality, I was very interested if there is more and if we could saturate these concepts with more than that, and with also less judgment and more meaning in order to think new things with these terms without necessarily wanting to solve some specific problems or arrive at some certain points. So to me, the one motivation definitely is to kind of explore this common parlance and search for inspiration in the computational. And the other would be also a very strong interest in materiality of language. So the way these concepts pick up meanings and consequences of their use and carry them into other discourses. It is not only about computation and architecture as two terrains, which we can clearly define and then distinguish and trace from one another, but simply to observe how they move across different discourses, different times, how even the time and movement are very entangled in this sense. And this is something that I was interested in terms of its materiality, and this is also where shadows come in and play an important role. So shadows as that instead of clarifying what concepts mean and what really code is about in architecture, we trace these shadows and we collect things. Another important topic is maybe the dark knowledge, which or the knowledge in darkness, or night is the model of knowledge, which I discussed then further in my contribution. But I would be actually interested at this point to hear how you would talk about the motivation to do the book.
Yeah, well, I think also what you mentioned in terms of kind of these words take on a kind of thickness, and I think that's what I found particularly interesting was how we often take, perhaps in a way of it misleadingly, we take language as being somehow transparent or organized into sort of a clarity that if it's just communicated properly, that we will be in sort of an immediate relationship with meaning or with the things that we want to communicate. And I thought it was very interesting to kind of meet the words with a kind of thickness, to not ask, about the utility or necessarily the efficiency of the way the words are being used or how these computational techniques or theories are being used, but rather to look at the kind of, look at the way that they actually cast shadows. So their first kind of objective, or the intention behind, is to say, okay, well, actually the clarification of the terms will cast out shadows, so bring light onto our understanding. But at the same time, they also cast anew shadows. They cast shadows anew. And so we're never really fully in the light. And even when we think we have eliminated, there's always the shadow that is still cast. And I think that shouldn't be seen as necessarily a problem, but as something that we can sort of articulate. Yeah, like you said, we gather shadows, or we gather the shadows that we cast through different forms of mediation. And I think in architecture, I think it's good, at least that's where I was coming from with some of my thoughts on this, was that it's very important that we engage with this, because we have a tendency to use the computer, for instance, as simply a tool that allows us to do something more quickly, more efficiently. And actually, it's also a kind of symbolic form, sort of techniques of symbolization, symbolic techniques that actually does shed light, but also cast shadow at the same time. But maybe if we go into more detail about some of the terms, which were the ones that you were working with, Selena, in your contribution in particular?
In my contribution, I was working with the notion of traveling of these concepts. So a sort of circulation and sort of an economy even of concepts. And I was specifically looking at that through the book of Michel Serres called Angels, a Modern Myth, whose title already contains this productive contradiction, in which myth and the modern are put together, and how can a myth even be modern? And in this book, Serres presents planes and passengers as angel messengers. So he really speaks about this. We could even say that this is importantly about the price of information, in which both planes and passengers are carrying partly these messages without energy, but also with significant and different amounts of energy, and how this contradiction can also then be unfolded to look at the movement across different places or different disciplines. One other important notion that I worked with of Michel Serres, or an idea, or an image rather, not even an idea. The image of the Northwest Passage informs this also importantly, because the Northwest Passage is the idea of articulating the importance and contingency of a technique to pass through the passage. So the passage has to always be found anew. And therefore, I found it a very important distinction in how people talk about this passage of concepts across disciplines. I analyzed the discourse of Mieke Balk, who wrote a book called Traveling Concepts, and in which she, on one hand, wants to also claim this plurality of meanings and the possibility to maintain a certain difference in weights certain words have in different contexts, still taking a rather analytical approach and proposing two types of propagation. One that is productive of meaning, and the other which is destructive of meaning. So to that I came with all that I have read from Michel Serres. I could not even identify a single book, and also his ideas also circulate through books, and it's not a material that you can simply cast a shadow on page number something and find that idea there. You will find it everywhere, and it's always going to also escape you partly. So you should always keep looking for it, like, in Travels of Jules Verne. And somehow where I found this to be an interesting entanglement was how he always how he avoids placing judgment to this movement and actually articulates it as sort of necessary. So to uncover new ways to pass through the Northwest Passage, which every year becomes a different map, or every year this passage is differently articulated, and every year you have to find your way through. And that's kind of every time you want to talk, you want to speak, you need to find your techniques.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you said about the weight of words was interesting, and kind of ties into what I was interested in my own chapter, which was on the hard and the soft. There's a tendency to maybe think that words are fully on the side of what we would call the soft, so that language is on the side of the soft, the organic, the sort of fuzzy, or the indeterminate, and the hard is like the abstract, mathematical, inorganic. And I think that was something that you see in my contribution. I tried to pick up a couple citations from well-known authors, from Jan Gehl to Amos Rappaport to Negroponte, and to sort of to kind of contemplate, I would say, was what I was doing, a proposal that actually Michel Serres makes in one of his books, which I think is called Relié. And the idea is that the soft and the hard are always intermingled. So this is, of course, he's building on the information theory of Léon Brillouin, who in part kind of highlighted the fact that that information and energy are in a way inseparable, that the information will ride on a channel, that it requires a certain background noise in order to foreground the information and the order that's on this channel, or foregrounded in front of noise. And I wanted to pick up how then this idea of the soft and the hard gives us, through the mediation of a sort of instrument, an ability to kind of decide what is in the light and what is in shadow, so that it's always articulated and isn't perfectly transparent to something like meaning or something like a truth, but rather is always articulating a sort of relationship between foreground and background. And this we do all the time. So in a way that the soft becomes energetic. So it's perfectly, I like the example of the plane, because yes, of course, we carry the messages of those who are on the plane, but of course their bodies have to also continue to consume energy. The plane consumes energy to transport them, and there's no message that would be free of at least one photon of light to be able to see what it is, to be able to read that message. So I thought that was very powerful, because it also takes us away from the idea that somehow with language we're free of all, or in speech we're somehow free of the material consequences or the energetic expenditures that we might otherwise think. But what would be interesting to know, Selena, is how, since the book, what you've been kind of working on, and how you see it kind of filtering into your current work.
Well, that's a fantastic question. And I would also like to mention here, before I go into the current work, this idea of evocation, which we explored together in the studio, the architectonics of noise, which I found also to be productive of bringing in these energies of words and then giving them different materialities. So I think that I would also like to hear from you if you would want to speak a little bit about the studio, or should we go directly into what we did after the book?
Yeah, no, I think we could say something about the studio. I mean, with evocation, it's I think as opposed to, I would say with casting out shadow, I think there's certainly an effort to, or an ambition to describe the explanation and description. I think are both efforts to try to cast out shadows, where I think evocation for me is more on the side of trying to kind of preserve a shadow in order to preserve a truth that cannot be properly described or properly explained. So I think that is definitely something we tried to work with in kind of a visual, in both I'd say in a linguistic, but also in a visual graphic manner with the studio. Certainly not easy to do, but it was very interesting to try to work out or try to work with the idea that we evoke rather than try to describe or explain a site, actually, because that's what we were doing. We were trying to invert site analysis, which seeks to kind of render into the kind of into a bare luminosity or a frank luminosity the elements of a site that can be broken down analytically. Instead, we were trying to say, let's evoke qualities that cannot be properly described or explained.
Yeah, because I believe that this might tie into what you did with your students that you teach now, or that you taught last semester with the personas. Mm-hmm. So I would be curious if you could continue on that line, maybe.
Yeah, sure. So last semester, the winter semester of 2021, I was participating in a studio with two other universities, University of Montreal and McGill University. And we each had different kind of orientations towards the studio approach. But we had a common site in Sweden, which was a small town of 8,000 people called Knivsta, between Stockholm and Uppsala. And one of the big constraints was that we couldn't go there because of the pandemic. So I had already had kind of an anticipation of what would it mean to go there with a group of students from mostly from Quebec, North American, to this small town in Sweden, and to suddenly with kind of no or perhaps certain preconceptions or certain ideas about what a small town in Sweden might be like. I wanted to set up kind of a story that would allow us to keep kind of at a distance the tendency to arrive towards a site and suddenly say, where's the problem? There's the problem. Okay, let's see how my architecture project can solve this problem. So I tried to set up the studio in a way that it was part of a story that I would see kind of as almost an abstract communication channel between us and this location that we could not visit. So Knivsta wanted to be the town where the future lives. That was their kind of slogan. And I wanted to take that seriously, to say, okay, this town wants to prepare itself to be the place where the future will reside. And so the story I set up was that our students were invited to build, design, and propose inns for 6 different innkeepers who had been invited by the town of Knivsta to come and set up a place where people could come and visit the home of the future. So, and the innkeepers I pulled from the work by Michel Serres called Pantopie, where he talks about these different personas in his work. So we had, for instance, Petit Poucette, Le Grand Fétiche, Luminescent, Le Tir Instruit, Hermès, Estia, Le Récitant. And so we were able to touch on different kind of global themes, I think, of kind of the human condition today, which I found quite interesting. So dealing with youth, technology, aging, how one alienates himself from themselves, and it's kind of a process of learning to be oneself by learning what one can do with their body and mind, how one can occupy the kind of space between the false and the true, between the black and the white, as a sort of kind of métissage. And then how messages travel, how they've stabilized around the hearth and the home. And then the whole idea of telling stories and working differently with heritage and memory in architecture. So I felt like these personas would allow the students to work with things that are kind of problems or obstacles we face today, and to be able to kind of embrace them in a way that they didn't necessarily try to solve them, because they were always too big to solve, but that could find ways to kind of embrace them in the buildings that they designed, the way that they chose to situate the building, where it should be in the town, what its relationship was with the way the town was going to be evolving. And the idea was that the students wouldn't try to solve anyone's problems, but rather act like guests whose host, who were being invited by a host. And the idea was that they weren't coming to, solve the problems or tell the host what's wrong with their house, kind of. So I think it worked relatively well, because We had some very interesting stories that the students were able to work with in talking about how they thought through the design of the inns and what they were for. But at the same time, then they were kind of very concrete with drawing building sections, plans, and also construction details. So it kind of worked well in a way. Yeah, I would say we were able to kind of marry, maybe not perfectly, but in a relatively interesting way, the evocation and kind of description and explanation. So yeah, I hope to do more studios like that one.
Yeah, certainly sounds really exciting and also really really different from how usually we approach architecture in places. And I find it to be very interesting to attempt to be so respectful without accusing the other of having to always give you the terms. So that I think is a really important practice today, where we are constantly encountering these gestures of representation and representing and speaking in the name of others in order to save them even, but always with kind of an accusative approach to what the other wants.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah,
Selena, where have you gone with some of the ideas from Ghosts of Transparency?
I have
taken a research project recently, no?
Yes, I have taken this to a research project which sort of documented the traveling of energies in the sense of watching the recordings of radio signals, which are themselves energy, and how and articulating a thick digital archive of these travels of energies in something that I named data observatories. And so I had a short and experimental, even called risky research project, which I developed over 1.5 year time, and in which I worked on developing these digital observatories, right, let's say, that explore materiality of radio signals, but without claiming to have immediate access to them or these energies, rather articulating their shadows in the sense of the way that radio casts digital shadows. So there is an archive of radio signals recorded by very contingent recording activities of people on Earth, and people record them and look at them, analyze them, and then upload them to this archive, and then also describe them there, describe what they're for, how they appear, describe all sorts of different things that they can know about them. And my interest was, how can we even really know signals, and what do we need to look at in order to think we know a signal or to identify a signal? One other interesting aspect of this archive is that it is supposedly even created for the activity of identification. So there are radio amateurs who want to know which signal they have caught. So you turn on your equipment and you listen, and then you hear something and you record it, and then you look at its patterns, you look at how the spectrogram will show you the rhythmicities and the different changes in the signal. You can figure it out based on the existing archive to which it somehow maps, or what you find to be similar as a human with eyes and ears, to signals that exist in the archive, and therefore you can then know that you heard, for instance, transmission related to some identification beacons. What is interesting about this is that, well, beyond this judgmental identification, which I would call judgmental in the sense of attempting to suspend judgment, which I hear also from your the way you talk about the studio and about what you really are supposed to do in a place. So I also try to approach, well, this data without expecting to know the correct name or purpose of a signal, but rather to try to articulate identities of different signals based on all the other signals that happen to have been recorded. So we don't care what is the name of the signal or what is its frequency, but we look at its properties, because any signal has a certain number of properties that we can track, and then we compare them to one another. So we developed and articulated this observatory that looks at a specific aspect of this recording. So it extracts a kind of symbolic, let's say, composition of a signal and of all signals, and then it compares them using the self-organizing map, and then it allows me to browse and walk through and see which ones are similar based on, for instance, how noisy a signal is, or how silent a signal is, or any property that I can identify in this recording. And then also always taking into account all other recordings. What I then did in order to access this very abstract data, which maybe was a very difficult choice after all, I really didn't want to work with something that is at first hand meaningful, something to which I would have even an illusion of immediate access, as I might have when I read a book. I definitely am confronted immediately with radio signal with a complete impossibility to access them. I can't even sense them, so there is no access. And this is problematic because then it's very hard to make sense of any sort of order that you get from them. But what we did is to project them on things that are meaningful, that still relate to the way the signals are. So one attempt was through their descriptions. So we analyzed this text of the descriptions and came up with sort of topics. And through these topics, I could read for instance, several signals or see which signals correspond or in some way tell about a specific topic and what are their relationships in terms of that topic. And so then that was one way of projecting, and another was to project the signals onto an archive of musical samples that are serving to organize and train computational systems to recognize different musical genres. And that was also kind of interesting because the idea of a genre is also very immediate, or definitely not an immediate one. And yet there is this tagged archive of musical genres, which you can use to say to a computer, look, these are the 8 different things we want to recognize. So here, learn about them. And then on top of that, we projected radio signals and looked at how they are then rendered similar in order to then also identify non-identified signals. So there is a certain number, almost a half of the signals in this archive are non-identified. People don't know what they are, but probably they're not unknowable. They're just not yet recognized by a person who is an expert. However, my digital observatory puts these together, and then you can see the known and unknown together, and you can maybe then speculate on this relationship that is evoked and that is emerging from these proximities in this kind of abstract space.
Mm-hmm. So you get kind of the 2 data sets. It's like you have the data set of the trained model of the pop music or of musical genres, and then you try to see where these signals would fall in terms of genres of music.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. So it's like you have a different kind of, you can get them to resonate, but then the way that they become partitioned is different depending on if you use this model that was trained on, I'm guessing, probably musical songs or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea behind all of this is to somehow break with, again, causalities between the inputs and outputs of digital information, and to sort of construct spaces of promenade or spaces of encounter with something unfamiliar, which you can then articulate and work with, because you do have a lot of information. It's only that mostly we approach this information as something given and not as guests. Definitely, we consider ourselves always as hosts of these digital situations and also of data. We think the data is somehow given, and therefore we can host it, and we can host it neutrally, and all data is equally welcome. But this is not. This is very sort of problematic in terms of in terms of recognizing or tracing the logics of data that is anyway always collected and depending on measurement or like the logics of measurement and observation.
Yeah, hosting, you mentioned hosting, and I that's hosting and guesting. It's like, I think it's something that merits additional research and thinking. I think that's one of the kind of trajectories that I think that I'm going to be going on in my work in the next couple months or years, maybe in relationship to the book. So for instance, at the moment I've gotten interested, I recently read the book Metamorphosis by Emanuele Coccia, this French-Italian philosopher who's also an agricultural engineer by training. And he sets up kind of, he's considered to be part of what some have called the vegetal turn in French philosophy. And what I find particularly interesting coming from my interest in architecture is that he questions this turn questions what they call the zoological prejudice. So of this kind of organism environment or man environment or person environment model that remains very prevalent today, and in a way kind of always posits a kind of mechanical relationship between living things and that which surrounds them or that in which they are plunged. And this produces, of course, kind of I would say a space or a gap between then the organism and the environment, and sets them up in kind of a dual dynamics or a dual mechanism. And I think this, in a way, postulates a transparency where there is actually a thickness. And this thickness, I find it articulated in an interesting way in Coccia's work through the idea of the atmosphere that we share with plants, a common breath. So the plant metaphor would be the metaphor that would be a more maybe accurate or contemporary, at least, way of thinking who or what we are in the world relative to the plants which have carried the atmosphere to its current state in such a way that we can breathe in the excess waste of the plants, and they breathe in our excess waste. So we kind of produce common atmospheres that allows each of us to live, even as we give the other what would cause us to die. So I think it's an interesting kind of a setup that always puts things in a kind of milieu, or at least thinks of things in a milieu, in a way that is not an environment. So it's not geometrical of a kind of a surrounding or an environment, but one of a more kind of material relationality, something that's communicational, but in a physical sense or in a natural sense. And I think it blends or blurs really well who is host and who is guest, because I think at one point, Coccia says that plants are at the same times the garden, the gardeners, and the gardeners, and the architects of the garden. So they are at once host, guest, and in a way a sort of third, which articulates the space in which one can host and one can be a guest. So there's something I think that in my work I would like to continue to think on those grounds, because on the one hand, it allows us to think can we call it a relationship? Yeah, with the world or with to think architecture as a kind of intermediary in this milieu that is, on the one hand, informational, physical, chemical, but it doesn't try to reduce everything either to just that. So in a way, we don't breathe and exchange and ingest what is around us the same way that other organisms do. And so it gives us kind of an exception. So there is kind of an exception here, there's kind of a humanism, but it's a non-anthropocentric one, because we are at the same time part of a process that we did not initiate. So we are, I think Coccia at one point in Metamorphosis phrases it as the earth speaks through us. That's this kind of poetic language that he uses. And I find that quite interesting as a way to think, also tying it to the idea in Michel Serres of the interferences, that we are also objects among objects and are not entirely conscious of all of the things that are going around in the natural world around us. So we could say we're not entirely conscious of all the shadows that are in fact cast, or all the things, or even all those potential sources of light And so I'd like to try to be able to think through a way that in architecture we can think with those ideas as a way to kind of not hinder our ability to project or to articulate, but to augment our ability to do so.
Well, I look forward to seeing more of that. I could connect to this articulation of the plant as I also remember that we discussed together while we were both at ATTP, the book by Kocha, the previous one on
Life of Plants.
Plants. Yes, I think it is. In which also there is this super interesting gesture of the double articulation as the plants go always up and down at the same time. And this is something that is as well kept rather intransparent because we perceive the growth of plants, but we do not perceive the growing in of the plants, and that both are equally important and are also, I mean, there was also something where plants kind of reverse the notions of growth and of even orientation. So yeah, I found this discussion on plants in Kocha particularly interesting, also as this kind of refusal of anthropocentrism and the connection between two supposedly opposing sides. And that I would like to speak a bit about my continuous interest in digital materiality, which I now hope to pursue through, or I'm interested to develop further in kind of again, a productive contradiction between the data sets and the data centers, which I would say, or which I would always start from as that which pertains to the soft and that which pertains to the hard, which are nevertheless completely interdependent and are part of the same plant, let's say, so that like one grows towards the other end, but are completely interdependent. So a data set only exists, let's say, in a data center, and a data center exists because of a data set, and yet we can analyze a data center through the means of like tangible materialities, and we can analyze a data set using computation in a sort of priceless manner. But I think what they really both deserve is to kind of be hosted in this in this contradiction, and I would like to therefore put them in a contradiction, which I consider to be an affirmation of artificiality. So I would like to, in them, find a way to speak about everything always being articulated and therefore artificial rather than given. So in a way that, data is naturalized as we spoke, and then it kind of obliterates this logic, if we want to look at it in a kind of priceless, in a material way, and that would be entirely and purely soft. And because we would like to affirm that nothing is, or I would at least like to observe how nothing is really ever only soft or only hard. And as you mentioned and also wrote about in your contribution to the book about this softness of the hard and hardness of the soft, which also is existing in the writing of Michel Serres and is articulated in many levels of his work, but also in your work. And I found it really exciting how you connected that to architecture in your text. Now, I do want to pursue this artificiality as a kind of an approach to this nature culture in distinction. Something that will be able to keep constant, so to keep it in the nature and culture in the term of artificial and in artificial thinking.
Excellent. So maybe we have material for the next book.
Probably so. Yeah, a book which has from two sides goes into the middle.
That's right.
And we write from two sides and we maybe meet in the center.
Mm-hmm. Great. Nice talking to you, Selena.
Yes, very nice talking to you.